long time ago. I have been at the Center for Government Research since 1990-91, so we have done a lot of work since then. We work around the state of New York, also in other municipalities. We've done a fair bit of this similar work in Ohio, and Pennsylvania, Maine, New Jersey, and some other communities. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be back here in the North Country, and a pleasure to work with the Revitalization Center. It's a good group. I think we've had a great discussion. So let me just move forward. Let me just make a couple of points. And we start thinking about this in fundamental terms. There's more information in the report. I don't want to belabor a lot of the things that you already know. The fact that Massena is in 3 towns does have an impact. Obviously, the fact that there aren't any residents actually in the Norfolk component says it's really a 2-town issue. But the Louisville component is important. That's where obviously where West Massena is. Not a lot of people, but at the same time there's some substantial property value. This is a densely populated residential portion of the village, so that's important. The other thing I want to highlight is that contrary to what we sometimes hear from Governor Cuomo, these municipalities work very closely together. That's something that I've discovered as I've done this work around the state. When you listen to the governor talk, you get he likes to communicate the impression that there's all these wasteful layers of government out in the state, and the state is somehow immune from that waste. And if we would simply eliminate layers, that we would save lots and lots of tax revenue. And I just have to say, from the work that I've done over many, many years in many communities around the state of New York, I think local government works pretty well in New York. We've run into some outstanding examples, but as a general rule, I'm pleased with the efficiency I see of local government. There's an old joke about economists. Economist and his friend are walking down the sidewalk, and the friend says, "Gee, look, there's a $20 bill on the sidewalk." And the economist says, "Nonsense. Had there been a $20 bill on the sidewalk, someone would have picked it up." And so on the one hand, it's making fun of economists and our assumptions. But, that is actually what we see out in the world, that if there's a lot of money to be saved, you guys figure it out. So you've done a lot of great things. You've got a shared municipal building. So you're co-locating a lot of your administrative functions. You're sharing a lot of back office services. You're sharing, physical facilities. The courts are almost merged at this point. They're not merged in fact, but they're kind of almost merged. Recreation services are jointly funded. But you've got a common fire service. You don't have 2 different fire departments. You've done, the Massena Business Development Corp. So you're doing a lot of things together. And the things that are obvious, you've already done. Again, it's a $20 bill on the sidewalk. You've already picked it up. So that suggests not that there aren't savings from merger, but I would argue that those savings are relatively modest. So there are some distinctions. First, public safety is the most important one, and I'll come back to that for some technical reasons in a few minutes. Clearly, you have a police force, a fairly large police force in the village of Massena. This is a community of concentrated residences, and in a community of concentrated residences, you need a police function. When you get out into the town, it's much more sparsely populated, and the need for that kind of a police presence is less. You rely on the road patrol and on the county or the state police. Public Works, this is probably the most distinct service that you still have. You still have really completely parallel public works operations. They're cooperative, but they don't actually. They're not actually either co-located or closely coordinated. So these are separate facilities. They have different functions because villages and towns have different needs, but they continue to be separate pieces. The other thing that makes this community distinct is the enterprises that the town manages. This is an unusual town, which makes the supervisor's job really unusual job. I mean, I don't know of any other supervisor, but supervising an airport, an electrical facility, you know, the rescue squad, and the hospital, which I know you are working on dealing with. Now it's under the management of the health system. So these are two large and well-functioning municipalities that do have different functions. So what would the advantages be of merger? I think, again, I want to say that the savings would be modest. You know, unlike the governor would, you know, you get the sense that the governor says, well, you probably cut costs in half if you merge these two completely redundant organizations. Of course, that's not true. You knew that wasn't true when we started this process. So, you know, from where we sit, we don't see rampant duplication. But there are some possible savings. So first, I'd argue that administrative functions have been co-located, but they're not wholly coordinated. So there may be some advantages of bringing some of those administrative functions under the same umbrella. Some duplication in finance and administration. We've not done a detailed analysis of this. But you're looking at personal services, total cost about $700,000, 10 to 15%. Would that be a reasonable expectation for a merger? Perhaps. Public works, once again, these are large functions. We're looking at $2 million in personal service costs in total. Again, 10 to 15% savings from some sort of a merger is not implausible. The savings might reach perhaps as much as $300,000. These aren't hard numbers. I'm just trying to give you a ballpark sense of what could be possible in the event of a merger. So, merger could be desirable in some respects. The question is it feasible? And you know, that's really the overarching question that we were asked to answer. And I don't want to beat around the bush. Merger really in this community really can't happen, and it can't happen for one particular reason, and that is the issue with the police. The state of New York. You know, first, let's acknowledge we need police for the village. The Sheriff's Road Patrol is about the same size for the entire, all of St. Lawrence County is about the same size as the Massena Police Department. So you can't really expect to disband the Massena Police Department and rely on the Sheriff's Road Patrol or rely on the state police. You're a village. You're a village of concentrated residences. You need a police department. The problem is that if you're talking about something like sewer or water or lighting or trash collection or all kinds of other services, fire protection, the state of New York would allow the village to dissolve and allow the town to create a service district where only the people who lived in that service district would pay for the service. And if you think about police, that might make sense in this case. So the village dissolves, the town takes over, the town creates a service district that's for the former residences and former properties of the village. And that would provide police services, and only those properties would pay for the police services. The problem is that that's not possible under New York state law. You would have to have a special act of the legislature to be able to make it possible for you to provide police only to the properties that are currently part of the village of the city. Now, this is an issue that, as the mayor knows, that has been irritant to those of us who do this kind of work for a long time. You know, shortly before I started this engagement, I got a call from a friend of mine who runs something called Pattern for Progress down in the Hudson Valley. And Jonathan calls and says, "Ken, this police stuff, it's making me crazy. You want to kind of do an effort, you know, try to move the state on this?" And I said, "Great, Jonathan." So we talked about who we want to talk to, and we landed on a guy named Jim Malatras. Malatras used to be the chief of state operations for the state of New York under Governor Cuomo. And Malatras had left that position and was running the Rockefeller Institute of Government. So Jonathan and I agreed that perhaps we would talk to Malatras and see if we could get Jim to think about whether this was something that the state should change. So it took us a long time to set it up, and we got the interview set up. I included the mayor. I thought, you know, who better to have this conversation than someone who was a police chief and is now a mayor and is in a community that's actively looking at dissolution. And we had a very disappointing, frankly irritating conversation where we made absolutely no progress. Belmontrose made it very clear that this was not an issue that the governor was going to take up, that it was very controversial in the legislature, and that if we wanted to change this, the only way we could make this happen would be to, in fact, get very customized, tailored legislation expressly for the village of Massena. And we would have to get absolutely everyone who cared about the issue to sign on before we could tackle it. So that's just a dead issue. I don't know whether you have any different impressions than I do, Mayor. It was not an encouraging conversation.
Correct.
So on the basis of that conversation, the only options are two. One, that you institute townwide police so that the village police department would expand and would cover all of the town of Massena. Or you have no police at all. So no police at all isn't an issue. Townwide police would be actually, frankly, rather expensive. We talked to the police chief about what that would cost. His estimates were substantial. The other problem is that we have West Massena. So West Massena is, this is a concentration of relatively highly valued properties that are in the town of Louisville. So not only would we need to have townwide police in the town of Massena, we would also have to have townwide police in the town of Louisville. That is, again, it's just difficult to imagine how that would move forward and how the people who would not be in that village area would feel about paying for townwide police service. People don't seem to be unhappy with the level of police service they have right now in the town of Massena or in the town of Louisville outside of the village. So the status quo from a public safety perspective works reasonably well right now. Sure, if money were no object, I'm sure that the community would love to have a townwide police for Louisville, townwide police for Massena, but money is an object, and it would be rather expensive. So, you know, that's why I get to my conclusion at the top. Is merger feasible? Bluntly, it is not. It's not one of the options I think you would want to entertain. So let me move on and talk about some recommendations, then we can have a conversation. We did gather information on calls for police service. This is from mid-18 to mid-19. You can see that there are substantial calls for service outside of the village of Massena. Not dramatic. In the West Massena portion is relatively small, only 15 calls for service over that period. But if you look at the town of Louisville outside the village, the town of Massena outside the village, those are a substantial number of calls for service. So once again, providing police service to all of both towns would not be free. And that additional cost would increase taxes. And that really wasn't the goal of this study, to increase taxes, but rather to reduce taxes. So again, going to recommendations. The fact that merger doesn't seem to be in the cards doesn't mean that there aren't some improvements. One of the things you could do fairly quickly would actually be to merge the courts. You're almost there. I suspect that there is confusion with town and village residents as to which court they're going to, who they write the check to, and you can reduce some of that confusion. Maybe there's cost savings. I kind of doubt it. It doesn't look as though there's a lot of money to be saved by merging the courts, but you're almost there, and it would be worth thinking about actually finalizing. Second point I'd make would be to explore a shared position for a municipal administrator. One of the observations we make in the report is we have a supervisor and a mayor who are both working full-time for a very part-time salary. The problem with that, I mean, that's great if you qualified people to do so, as you do. But that's hard to do. It's hard when these two gentlemen decide that they are going to step down and they're not going to be providing full-time qualified service for a part-time salary, then you have to find someone else who's willing to run for those positions, who's willing to make that same personal sacrifice. And I think that that is a risk for the community, because these are complex, large organizations. You need a qualified administrator to run them. And one way to improve the level of collaboration would be to have a shared administrator. So that would mean instead of having to, for both of you to be paying for a full-time administrator, perhaps by joining forces, you could create a shared position. And that shared position have the vantage point to be able to ask the question, for example, about administrative services. Are there roles, is the finance function, does the finance function work as efficiently as it might? Or are there ways in which a common administrator might find ways to improve the efficiency of the finance function? Same thing for the clerk functions. You have two clerks. You know, is there a way, if you had a common administrator, to identify some efficiencies that might apply if this was being run by a common administrator? And then finally, I make the same point about public works. Clearly, that this is the place where I think there's the greatest potential for savings. You know, and I think you have to look at decision points. I'm a big fan of doing things in small bits. Trying to do something all at once is sometimes really controversial. So you look for opportunities. If you have a retirement of a chief executive of one of these functions, you might say this is the time to think about whether we want to have a shared administrator for public works. Is there a point at which a major facility needs to be replaced or needs significant investment? Then maybe that is a time to think about looking at a shared facility. So, you know, we were called into, we did some similar work in 4 Cleveland suburbs a few years ago. We were talking about a shared facility for public works, only to discover that the year before they had entertained this large question about merger, 3 of the 4 facilities had undertaken major renovations of their public works garages. So we had these 3 facilities where, I had 3 of the chief electeds saying to me, you know, I think this notion of sharing a facility is a really good one. In fact, we just invested in ours, so why don't we consolidate in our facility? And of course, the other 2 said the same thing. Only one of them was really interested in actually going to somebody else's facility because they'd already put all this money to renovation. So when you see a need for renovation, you see a need to reinvest in a facility, that's the time to ask whether co-location really makes some sense. Again, co-location leads to new opportunities. There's a strong spirit of cooperation between the public works functions, but I think if you had a common administrator and or you had a common facility, that new opportunities would arise. You know, again, you put yourselves on a course to saving some money for the taxpayers. And with that, I will quit talking and entertain questions.
Questions from town council or trustees first, please.
When we were talking before the meeting started, we did have an administrator at one time. And my feeling, looking at it right now, is you get a shared administrator. I'm not talking about DPW, I'm talking about a shared administrator. The guy better have an S on his chest because he's going to need it. You're going to, you know, problem comes up. This has to be done now. Well, no, I got to be done yesterday, and that type of thing.
I think that as Steve and Timmy will attest, those are issues that they deal with all the time. And, they have to be on top of a lot of different issues all at once. And I completely agree that particularly a shared administrative position between a town and a village, particularly given the number of different, the variety of services,
Different functions, yeah.
the different functions that you have, that would be a challenge. But I know a lot of really qualified administrators. I speak to the City Managers Association every other year. I just came from their annual meeting about a month ago, and I know a lot of those people, and you know, there are some really fine people kicking around the state who've got strong experience and a lot of experience being apolitical administrators. And again, that becomes the key. You can't have an administrator, particularly if it's a joint administrator or the town or village who has political aspirations. You know, This has to
No,
be someone who
you
stays.
wouldn't want that.
You wouldn't want that at all. But then the mayor and the supervisor can worry about those political issues. So it doesn't always work, but I've seen a lot of circumstances in which an apolitical administrator can really add a lot to a community. It's just a thought.
Thank you.
Speaking about the Public Works, we had some discussions when the village moved their sand and salt to their present location. We talked about the town moving theirs there. The issues that came up, first of all, was that the roads were not heavy enough for our trucks, which are heavier and larger. The town has a different sand salt mixture. Not to mention the dividing that up. Who took this many scoops, who took this many scoops of sand and salt. But the town also provides services to the county and to the state. So our sand salt mixture is different than the village's. The other issue was the travel time to get from the village out to the town roads, which would add cost to the taxpayers outside the village for that time allotted to travel to those town roads. The other issue with this is, I believe both DPW and our highway have totally different positions and totally different services they provide. Our highway superintendent also manages the airport, which is a job in itself. So to say that one person could handle all the aspects of the village, including water, sewer, roads, sidewalks, garbage, and all that, and then handle the town roads, which is preparing roads for paving, culverts, drainage, as well as the airport, would be a same scenario as the mayor and the supervisor, one person doing the job of 2 or 3 people. So I would think if that was the case and they did combine, I would think that that administrator would need more staff to handle some of those extra duties either way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that would be necessary, and I guess my thought is that if you have one person who is looking at the entire umbrella, that one person, it's not that you would simply lose the position. I think that the advantage would be in identifying, where those savings really could be, and asking questions about how those different, what appear to be challenges now, see how serious those challenges might be and whether they could be addressed. I think there's a strong incentive when you have 2 organizations for sometimes to overemphasize the uniqueness of one function over another. So that's my suggestion. The thought that you had a single administrator, not that it would replace one person doing the job of 2, but one person supervising the work of the 2 organizations. I think that might find some advantages over time. Maybe it would stay independent forever, but I think that if you had one person in charge of both functions, you might find some opportunities that might not seem apparent when they're separate. But no, I'm not suggesting that you would take 2 people and have one
Okay.
person do both jobs.
So to go along with that, I guess when you look at the clerks, right, so where do you get the $100,000 savings? Is that by eliminating one clerk? Or, because there are different functions as well. Our town clerk, there's a lot of licenses and all, the town business, as well as the village clerk has a whole separate schedule of duties. So where is the $100,000 savings, or where would you project that from?
Yeah, and I, as I said, those are simply examples. I'm just saying if you've got a 10 to 15% savings, think about 10 to 15%. If there were a way to change how the services are delivered, to change how the front office is run, change who does what. It's probably not at that top level that you'd see the savings, but perhaps you'd see better coordination below that level. Again, I'm not saying that we did not do a careful study of all the different functions and all the different individuals, but if you did have a single administrator looking at all of those functions and asking how they can be most effectively combined, I think you probably would see some savings. Maybe not 100,000, maybe 50,000, maybe very little, maybe it would just be more efficient, and maybe you wouldn't save any actual money. I understand your reluctance, but again, the co-location is great, it just gives you some great opportunities. It's just that if you don't have one person who is, you know, if they don't report up to the same individual, then there isn't an incentive to find those ways in which they can work better together.
So the 10 to 15%, how was that picked for your figure to use?
It is purely an arbitrary, it is exemplary. You know, I'm saying if you've got $2 million in spending for public works, personnel service, I think in most organizations we look at a 10% savings. If you're combining organizations, is a reasonable goal. And when we're in a position to actually look at specific positions, we're usually able to identify those savings. They're relatively non-controversial. But this is exemplary only. I've not done a time, you know, a time study by position to be able to come up with that number. Again, I'm thinking if you were to bring these services closer together with a common administrator, I think you put yourself in the way of finding those opportunities. And that would happen over time. It wouldn't happen immediately. You know, a position becomes available through retirement, and then you ask the question whether that particular position needs to be replaced exactly as it was. And that happens in our organizations all the time. But if you put the two organizations together, I think those opportunities would become apparent.
I guess, you know, with that too, it adds another layer, which the residents of the village of Massena pay for the maintenance of the village roads. The residents of the town of Massena outside the village pay for the maintenance of those roads outside the village.
Right.
So then you're looking at some sort of system to keep track of that so that those are split as well.
Right.
So there is I guess might be some difficulty with that segregation.
When we had the administrator, maybe it was just the first adventure into that realm didn't work out that well. And I think
That was just the village administrator.
that was just the
Wasn't
village
town
administrator.
Wasn't us.
And like you say, getting the right person would be a task in and of itself. That person, like we said, that person, say just, you got a retired school teacher, and the retired school teacher wants to be the village administrator. Okay, but he's already retired, and that's a second income for him. Then you've got the younger guy coming in who wants it, and you just get him straightened around, and he gets himself straightened, and he leaves for a bigger job.
Yeah, I think you're much more exposed with with relying on your executive leadership coming from an elected position, particularly when that elected position is underpaid. I mean, one of the things you could do would be pay your supervisor and your mayor appropriately, because they've got full-time jobs right now. That's not usually, you weren't looking for us to tell you to spend more money. But I'm telling you, you should be spending more money under executive leadership, because it's right now you're very exposed to these two gentlemen leaving and having someone come in who is willing to run for the position, but doesn't actually have the expertise to be able to do the work, or isn't willing to put in the hours necessary to do the work well. So I think it's much more risky. Again, I think you need to be spending more money on executive leadership. One way to do that would be to have a common administrator between the two. It's just one thought. Again, I'm just, it's one exposure I see here. It's one risk I see in this community. Again, you've got two full-time positions that are getting paid at part-time wages. Just, it's a risk.
So one of your recommendations is a joint administrator. Another recommendation is to explore the kind of togetherness of highway departments and DPW.
When the time's right.
When the time. Do you see those both? Would it be a smart play to try to achieve both of those? Or is it one versus the other?
I guess what I would think would be the ideal pattern would be to say, gee, we've got this issue with the courts. We're probably ought to do a merger of the boards. You know, we may have we've got a problem right now. I mean, I think you have a problem right now, again, of not spending enough on your executives. So if you were to address those two problems, bring in someone as a village administrator to take some of the burden off the mayor and the supervisor. And then one of the tasks for that individual would be to plan long-term for the public works function. Because again, most of the money is in public works, most of the savings potential is in public works. So I guess I would do it sequentially. I would say, let's look at this administrative function, see if we can address again, you two gentlemen are doing a great job, but again, I see great exposure here from two people doing full-time work for part-time pay. So I think you could address as a community that problem, and then put yourself in a position where someone would be charged to explore efficiencies across both town and village without merging. You can see you can achieve a lot of the goals of merging without merging, and I think that a common administrator would be one way to. But that's just one. It's just one thought that occurs to me. There may be other ways to accomplish that, but I do think that there are some savings to be had. Possibly, if you're asking sequentially, I would look at that common administrative function and look to that individual. And if you bring in a professional administrator, there are a lot of wonderful people in the state of New York who have been doing this kind of work for a long time, who I think bring a lot of ideas.
So, when you talk about merging the court, do you mean dissolving the village? Or, I mean, they're pretty well merged now.
Yeah, they're pretty well merged now, right? So I'm just saying, just kind of complete the thing. You call it a town court, you call it a village court, it doesn't matter.
The bottom line is what we got in this town and village is we lost big industry, alcohol, General Motors, and you're talking, you want to hire a manager. We had one for a while, didn't work out at all. And because first guy got a raise was him, and he was close to $100,000, he was only there about 3 or 4 years. That money could put a better use for what the people that are running the town and the village today. What the mayor gets, what the supervisor gets, what the councilman gets, what the trustee gets is peanuts compared to go out and get a manager. That's my personal feeling. The bottom line is, it costs some money what you're going to do. If you can save money, don't add to it. I agree with where you're coming from, but
Yeah,
I don't believe it.
Yeah, I understand that. I live in the town of Arundequoit in Monroe County, and the town of Arundequoit historically, even though we're the second largest town in Monroe County, and we've got a annual budget of $360 million, it's a big operation. We have the lowest paid full-time supervisor in the county, and I'll tell you, one of the things that we saw happen is because we had this constant revolving door of supervisors. We'd have people come in for a couple of years in retirement and they leave, or we'd have young people on their way up who comes and then they leave. They made a lot of decisions that we're paying for as taxpayers. And one of the things they did is it became really obvious that the town of Arundequoit would go out and borrow for just about anything they wanted. It was pretty easy to talk, well, let's just borrow the money. So a friend of mine was a bond counsel to Arundequoit for a while. He says, yeah. They would bond a pencil. So long as they could convince themselves the pencil would last more than a year, they'd go out and they'd borrow for a pencil. So we've got a really significant debt burden. And so it was not the best administration. And I think they cost us more money long-term than they saved us. So sometimes you need to spend money to save money. But I hear you. I understand your point.
Any of the cost savings, how would they come? Would be personnel, right?
Yes. I mean, this is a personnel business, right? Local government is all about people. So you need to be using using positions you have effectively. You can do a lot through attrition. I'm not saying that I mean, again, we didn't see evidence that that there should be people fired here, that you're way overstaffed. I'm just suggesting, and again, I think that the operations are run pretty well. But over time, you can affect some efficiencies, I think, by looking, if you understand how the functions work together.
questions from the table? And I'll open up to public questions. I would ask you to please stand, state your name for the record. Mr. Graham.
My name is Joe Gray. I live at 105 West Hatfield Street. I'm going to stand and I'm going to sit back down. Is there a detailed study somewhere?
There is a report, and we're going to, it's currently draft, we'll finalize it based on the conversation we had tonight, and then that will be available.
If you didn't study details as far as job duties, all that kind of stuff, so is this like a view from 10,000 feet, or?
Yeah, it's a view from 10,000 feet. Precisely, the key question we were asked was, what are the, whether merger is feasible and desirable. And, we did not do a detailed time and motion study for every position.
So you didn't look just at what happens if the village dissolves tomorrow? If we have, for example, if somebody circulated a petition called a referendum, as happened at some of our neighbors not long ago, that wasn't really looked at.
No, that wasn't. I mean, if that petition was received, then you would have to, you'd be required by state law, 17A, to go and do that detailed study and identify how that would work, which would be really interesting in this place. I mean, it's one of the things that if you think about it, because you have these two large organizations, and I've got a public meeting in Sinclairville in Chautauqua County on Thursday night. And Sinclairville is a very small village split between two fairly robust town governments. And there it's fairly easy to figure out what would happen. Here, it would be really an interesting challenge.
I was a little confused by the police evaluation. Why would we consider calls to the entire town of Louisville?
Well, because the state won't allow you to simply have a town, a police department.
I understand that,
Yeah,
obviously
okay.
special legislation.
Right.
But if the village, one of the options was to simply stop the providing police service in, what was it, 15 calls?
It's a very small number of calls,
Right.
but it's still, it's a good-sized population, and these are, and this is a neighborhood that I think would value its police department. But it's an option. You could, if the village were to decide to dissolve, not providing police service at all is one of the options. It just seems like implausible that would pass a referendum.
Okay. Two other quick things. How many other full-time elected officials in St. Lawrence County are there? Are you familiar with any?
Answer to that question, I'm sorry.
I'm not familiar with any. That's why I'm asking. It's not a loaded question. The mayor of Ogdensburg is not full-time. The city of Ogdensburg, they have an administrator, mind you. I was the town administrator. I was the town supervisor for 8 years. It wasn't, when I came in, a full-time job. I still don't believe it's a full-time job. As a matter of fact, my first day in the job, I said to the town employees, they're not paying me a full-time salary. I won't be here full-time. And I don't think the town fell apart in those 8 years. Didn't have a lot of complaints. Chuckle away, boys, chuckle away. And, nothing didn't get done. I'm a little bit confused by that. And the last thing, I guess, is if an administrator were hired and took over these responsibilities, what exactly will the supervisor and the mayor do?
Well, the supervisor and the mayor, I mean, this is an unusual form of government. There are a lot of communities in the state of New York that manage this. The mayor and supervisor still responsible for setting policy, for working with the boards to determine appointments, identifying challenges that confront the communities. I mean, you do have as some of you have mentioned, because of the loss of your industrial employer employment base, these are communities that are challenged right now. So there's lots of good work out there to be done.
That's not being done now. I would agree.
Yeah, I'm not gonna weigh in on that.
Okay,
I
no,
think
that's fine.
there's a lot of work there that particularly in communities that are economically challenged.
Bob Ilsner, Massena. I like the point that you made about doing things in baby steps. And that there's a lot that you can do without actually officially having to merge. Sam listed a bunch of obstacles, like road salt mix. I don't know, I'm not a road salt expert, but if the village uses one type of road salt and the town uses a different type of mix, and they're both working, or get together and figure out why you can't use the same mix. I mean, it's plain and simple, if there's a regulation that says it has to be a certain one for DPW, or state roads or whatever, then the village probably should consider adopting that one. If there's no regulations, I don't see why we can't come together and merge and make that type of change. So I agree with you. I think we need to be a little bit more open when it comes to these obstacles and explore the obstacles with savings on the mind.
And we have been open. The state requires us to have a certain salt mixture. I don't recall if it's what the percentage is, as well as the county with our contract with them. So that if it was a combined sand and salt pile, the village would have to step up their salt. Now that might, I'm just guessing, that might raise problems with their drainage. You might have more salt that runs off to the river. I'm not sure. I'm just guessing at that. Okay. The other thing is, like I said, the village residents pay for the maintenance of the village roads. The town residents pay for the maintenance of the town roads outside the village. So then we'd have to monitor who's using how many scoops of sand and salt so that they're charged accordingly to each various department.
To me, those are things that can be looked at.
It can be. And we spent months and months and months looking at this and talking about it. When we looked at bringing the town highway over to the village. And like I said, the issues were the roads, the more traffic. I believe that the trucks are heavier, that's what we came to a conclusion. And they'd have to be built up to handle our trucks. The travel of the trucks from the village, present village, DPW, out to the town roads to do that plowing. So, I mean, we have done that. I'm open to it too. If it's gonna work, it's gonna work. I mean, they'd have a nice fuel delivery system down there. We also have our own fuel delivery system for our vehicles.
I just see barriers, and I think what he's saying is it's time to start looking at tearing down some of the barriers and being a little bit more progressive and thinking a little more outside the box.
We have
a little
been.
more cooperative.
We have been. You
So,
saw the
okay,
list. You saw a list of things that we have been merged with and sharing.
Right.
And if there's anything that we can do that's going to save money, we're going to do it.
All right, okay.
Justin Niles, 58 Cornell. So how many of the extra town responsibilities, i.e. the hospital, airport, electric, how many of those have independent boards that give suggestions already? Do all those have that?
Yeah, everyone has a board.
So that somebody as a speakerhead goes directly to the town supervisor and says, this is what I believe?
No, we actually attend their meetings. We're liaisons. Each board has 2 liaisons. We attend those meetings. If they have an issue that comes up and we can help, we'll either help through our government or through the county government or the state government and work on those issues.
Most of them have boards.
Sure, so.
Rescue squad has boards.
Yeah, so is it safe to say for the most part, they are essentially run about 75–80% on their own already? And as a liaison, you kind of work together if you need to help out with something, but they already kind of have their own direction that they go. Am I correct on that?
Well, there's personnel issues. We negotiate the contracts for each one of those entities. You know, we're deeply involved in every one of them.
Sure,
You know.
I was just trying to figure out what,
And
I mean, I understand that there's a portion of what the town supervisor has to do, and there's a portion that the village mayor has to do, but how many of those already have appointees that speak to them already? So if there was somebody, like, let's say you did have an administrator could get one area on one centralized, straight line value. So that way, when it comes to the DPW merging. You have one person that can help set the right pace of that instead of having small hurdles get in the way. Because like the salt sand mixture, I mean, you could have, what, 2 different piles of sand, couldn't you?
Oh, good.
Exactly.
That's what we have right now. We have our- That's
So
what we
I
have
guess-
now.
Where's
the savings?
Where's the savings?
Well,
mean,
land would be the first one, right? So you open up more land that's already non-taxed, and you sell that off to somebody else that can now pay taxes on that property. There would be not, but, well, one, you'd have a savings of a building, and 2, you'd have a gain of income, right?
We wouldn't,
Efficiency, gaining of
I
efficiency.
mean, that's, and how many roads have to be fixed to be able to take the load of your trucks already? Because I mean, you're going down, what, South Racket to go to the other spots. There's
They're
only
talking
three,
about-
there's only 3
they're
streets.
talking about the roads in the DPW, actually.
Yeah, so there's only 3 streets that are connector roads that are
I'm
already
just-
county roads.
I'm just
or
putting
state
everything,
roads.
I'm just putting everything out there that we discussed back when the villages, brought the sand and salt to that area, and we were looking at the town as well. I'm just bringing out every little aspect of that, so people know, what those were.
Sure, and I'm just kind of putting that out there. I mean, if we need to put down 3 more inches of stone on Robinson Road, what is that, 1,000 feet? I mean, it's just kind of one of those things that I look at as, do we really need to have 2 separate entities? And the village has quite a bit of area, though I know it's somewhat locked up in, I believe, like green districts, which the town has a lot of other green areas that we could take advantage of. Maybe there's something we
I
can work
can,
with.
I can see a savings
That
with.
seems like a really great start,
Yeah,
instead of getting
Yeah.
held up.
there could be
Because
savings with a loader operator that's loading the trucks.
Because I mean, I've driven by the town highway building, and I can notice that that's going to need a serious look. And as a taxpayer, why am I paying for another building?
You're not paying
It's
for it.
essentially,
You're not paying for it.
I'm not paying for it.
That's, residents of the town outside the village pay for that.
I would have to assume at some point or another on my town tax bill, because I do pay town taxes as a village
You
resident.
do.
So I do pay towards streets or
Yep, the
town
resident-
roads, right?
The residents in the town outside the village pay more than the residents inside the village.
Yeah, but I'm still paying. That's,
You're not paying for that, though. That's this whole separate line item.
okay, so I would have to assume that eventually, somewhere down the line, there's going to be a trickle where money is gonna
No.
have to go in. I mean, that's just.
There are some towns, that have the roads outside the village in the town, that the village residents also pay for those roads. Just like you and I pay for the county roads, we also pay for the state roads.
Sure.
But the residents outside the village that live in the town pay for the town highway maintenance, period.
So I don't pay any highway maintenance.
All
in my
those roads out in the
tax.
town that you ride, or drive on or whatever, you don't pay for those.
Okay, so
The
but anyway,
equipment, all
I
of it.
guess at some point, I'm still paying somewhere down the line for some part of the service.
Highway superintendent
Right.
is townwide, I believe.
So,
Highway superintendent position is townwide cost.
Town outside the village.
The superintendent,
Mhm.
not the main.
The airport portion of it is, that's the entire town, the airport portion, not the highway department.
okay, I guess I'll have to do a little bit more research on that, because I'm just trying, I guess at my point now is where is my tax money going for my town taxes? Right, because I get 95% of my services from the village, and I'm still paying the town tax. You know, somebody, I find it hard to believe that, how many residents in the town? Probably maybe 1,500, 2,000.
So your assessment is how much?
My assessment right now, shot in the dark, maybe 68,000.
So you're paying about $250 maybe a year for town taxes, maybe $275.
I think it's a little bit higher than that.
Well, 200,000 is $800. That's outside the village.
Okay, so,
So
yeah,
you're
I'm
paying
not
less
gonna
than-
get
whatever.
that crazy thing. I guess
Yeah.
eventually down the
So-
road, I bet you I'm
So
paying
you're paying,
somewhere.
you're paying for the museum, which is.
Whether it be in
normally-
sales tax.
You're paying for the library, you're paying for the town employees, right, the town clerk, and you're paying for the assessor. you're paying, actually, our fire is actually separate as well, right? That's a contract.
Yep.
So you're paying for the town employees that are part of the village, other than the highway department.
Okay. So I don't know if anybody else kind of gets run by with that, but you guys take sales tax and you put it towards the highway department at all? You guys get sales tax?
I don't believe that goes towards, I mean,
Yeah.
we get the
So,
sales,
I
we
mean-
get sales tax that's generated outside the village,
Sure.
and the village gets a portion of the sales tax generated within the village.
Okay. So that's all I got.
Mhm.
Just kind of leading down a rabbit hole, I guess, I don't know.
Mr. Gardner, could you help me understand? So, from looking at your proposal, this is kind of phase one, existing conditions, is that correct? Is that where we are in this process?
No, we're at the end. This is the draft. We're gonna, wrap this up with some recommendations, and that will be the end of the study.
So dissolution wasn't looked at all? Wasn't considered, wasn't on the table?
Dissolution was rejected as an option.
Okay.
By whom?
Well, by our study.
Okay.
What we put out in front of you is the barriers to dissolution.
Right.
And, in our view, and in consultation with the reorganization study committee, we found those barriers to be insurmountable. So that, then we back into, how can you share services more effectively and save money. The dissolution, from the perspective of our study, and I think with the agreement of the reorganization study committee, is off the table.
Will you come back and say a year, 2 years, 3 years, and look back into this at all? Or is this the final?
Unless the state changes its policy with respect to providing police services, it's inconceivable to me that the village would vote to support dissolution. That becomes the challenge. It does come to a vote. No matter how you structure this, the village residents would have to vote in favor of dissolution. So unless you as a town board were willing to embrace the notion that you would have town-wide police service, I think the village would have to confront the possibility of not having police coverage. And I think from a political perspective, it would be hard to believe that the village would be willing to say that. So that's the challenge. But again, it's something we've been fighting for a long time at the state level, because it doesn't make any sense. And we confront this at community after community after community. Malone, just a few years ago, similar study in Malone, same problem. It did go to a vote in Malone. And the village residents said, you know what, we're not going to have police service? This doesn't make any sense. And they don't even have a road patrol in Franklin County. So they're going straight to state police, and the village residents in Malone said, this doesn't make any sense for us to not have police. So this, and there are many other studies. Potsdam has confronted the same problem, and then communities around the state are looking at it.
So by the numbers, it looks like the police department would almost have to double.
That is roughly what the police chief suggested.
So it'd be 3 million plus,
Yes,
plus startup costs.
yes.
New officers, new uniforms, new weapons, new vehicles.
Right. And what's interesting about that is that the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit that the state offers, which would be nearly $1 million for these municipalities, 70% of that is supposed to go to tax reduction. So how you can increase your spending by more than the CETC and still use 70% of that for tax reduction, it just,
Yeah.
not that the state has ever, tried to monitor that, but still.
Is there a guarantee of the $1 million?
Yeah.
There is?
Yeah, the state's been spending, last year the state spent shelled out about $10 million for municipalities that had dissolved. That, although it's
So it's
not.
guaranteed for how long? How many
Yeah.
years?
It has to be approved in the budget every year, correct?
Yeah, so this is in permanent law, but it has to be appropriated, just like anything else that's in permanent law. There is a similar provision for school districts. What's interesting about the school district law is that there is a 14-year phase-out period for the incentive. So the school districts, if they dissolve, they know they're going to get a certain amount of money, but they know that it ends after 14 years. When they passed this law, for some silly reason, they didn't put a sunset in. So they said that you're going to get this forever. I don't believe that's likely. If the state legislature is going to be giving Massena $1 million every year, will that last forever? Probably not. So there's going to come a point at which the legislature is going to come back together and they're going to say, well, you know, we didn't put a sunset in this thing, but we probably ought to. And so I would think, and I make this very clear to any of the communities we talk to, that the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit probably will change something. You know, it's Andrew Cuomo's baby, so as long as Andrew Cuomo is in office, nothing's going to happen to it. But if Cuomo leaves office at some point, I would think there might be a move in the legislature to change it. So that's a challenge with this thing. Again, I think if it was on a 14-year phase-out like the school district, you know, nobody would mess with it. But given that it's in law, it's permanent, it just, you know, probably won't continue forever. It just seems unlikely.
Kent, one of the things that, that we had talked about during the deliberations that we had